Discarded like common trash, a battered metal box held secrets that could topple an empire. They thought Ayan was just a senile old man clinging to meaningless scraps of his faded glory days. They were dead wrong. What he wired together in the dark didn't just break the rules, it broke a conspiracy. Ayan Harrison's hands possessed a slight permanent tremor, a persistent souvenir from the Tet Offensive that no amount of medication could ever fully quiet. Yet whenever those calloused, age-spotted fingers gripped the cold steel of a soldering iron, the shaking miraculously ceased. At 78 years old, Ayan was a resident of the Whispering Pines assisted living facility in Boulder, Colorado. To the nursing staff, he was just room 214, a quiet, stubbornly independent widower who took his pills without complaint and spent entirely too much time tinkering with what they assumed was dangerous electronic garbage. To Ayan, however, the heavy olive-drab metal casing sitting on his small laminate desk was not garbage. It was a lifeline. It was a heavily modified Collins R39OAA, heavily modified Collins R39OA, communications receiver, a relic from his days as a communications specialist in the United States Army Signal Corps. He had spent the better part of a decade rebuilding it, sourcing rare germanium diodes, swapping out blown capacitors, and wiring in a custom frequency-hopping module he had designed himself. It wasn't just a radio. It was a testament to his continued usefulness in a world that had aggressively moved on without him. The trouble began on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside was the color of bruised, iron-threatening sleet. Ayan was in the middle of calibrating a particularly stubborn vacuum tube when the door to his room swung open without so much as a polite knock. Gregory Hayes stood in the doorway, a clipboard pressed against his tailored charcoal suit. Hayes was the regional director of the facility, a man whose ambition was outmatched only by his total lack of empathy. He viewed the elderly residents not as people, but as line items on a corporate ledger. He was flanked by two burly orderlies who looked entirely too eager to follow his commands. "Mr. Harrison." Hayes sighed, stepping into the room and immediately wrinkling his nose at the faint smell of melted rosin core solder. "We've had this discussion. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of your residency agreement explicitly forbids the possession of unauthorized non-UL listed electrical appliances." Ayan didn't look up carefully, setting his soldering iron into its safety stand. "It's a receiver, Mr. Hayes. It draws less current than the commercial hairdryer Mrs. Higgins leaves plugged in down the hall. It's perfectly safe." "It is a fire hazard," Hayes countered, his voice dripping with condescension. He stepped closer, his eyes raking over the exposed circuit boards and the tangle of multicolored copper wiring spilling out of the radio's chassis. "And quite frankly, Ayan, it's an eyesore. This facility prides itself on a clean, modern aesthetic. Corporate is doing a walkthrough tomorrow. I will not have this junk sitting in plain view." Ayan's jaw tightened. "That junk saved a platoon in the Aya Drang Valley. It's not hurting anyone." "It's a liability," Hayes snapped, losing his thin veneer of corporate patience. He gestured sharply to the orderlies. "Clear it out, all of it, and check the closet for any other contraband." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Ayan's chest. "You can't do that. It's private property." He tried to stand to place himself between his prized possession and the advancing men, but his bad knee buckled, forcing him heavily back into his chair. He was suddenly agonizingly aware of his own frailty. He could only watch in silent, burning humiliation as the orderlies roughly unplugged the receiver. They didn't even bother to coil the power cord. One of them scooped up the heavy chassis, careless of the delicate internal components, while the other swept Ayan's carefully sorted boxes of spare vacuum tubes and resistors into a plastic garbage bag. "Consider this a final warning, Ayan," Hayes said, adjusting his cuffs. "Next time you'll be facing eviction. We don't tolerate hoarders." Within 2 minutes, the room was empty of everything that mattered to the old veteran. Ayan sat in the sudden, crushing silence, staring at the empty patch of desk. He felt a deep, profound hollowness, a sense of violation that went far beyond the loss of a machine. They hadn't just taken a radio, they had stripped him of his agency, his history, and his voice. Later that evening, the promised sleet began to fall, drumming a relentless, mocking rhythm against Ayan's window pane. He couldn't sleep. He knew exactly where the radio was. The facility's main industrial dumpsters were located at the far edge of the staff parking lot, waiting for the Wednesday morning collection. Down in the basement of the facility, Turner Patterson was finishing his shift. Turner was 19, a junior college dropout working maintenance to pay off overwhelming medical debt from his mother's illness. He was quiet, observant, and largely ignored by the administrative staff. He had been changing a fluorescent bulb in the hallway when Hayes had raided Ayan's room. Turner had seen the whole thing. He had seen the look of utter devastation in the old man's eyes, a look that reminded Turner painfully of his own grandfather right before he passed away. Turner clocked out at 11 p.m. He pulled on his worn Carhartt jacket, bracing himself for the freezing sleet. As he walked toward his rusted Honda Civic, he paused. He looked toward the massive green dumpsters barely visible under the flickering amber light of a solitary street lamp. He knew what Hayes had ordered discarded. He also knew that Hayes was a tyrant who regularly skimmed from the maintenance budget, leaving Turner to fix broken heating units with duct tape and prayers. Muttering a curse under his breath, Turner changed direction. The sleet stung his face as he hoisted himself up and peered over the rim of the freezing metal dumpster. The smell of rotting food and antiseptic wipes hit him, but there, sitting miraculously atop a pile of flattened cardboard boxes, was the heavy olive-drab casing of the radio. The orderlies had been too lazy to bury it. Turner reached down his muscles, straining as he hauled the 40-pound piece of equipment over the edge. It was freezing to the touch, and one of the dials had been bent in the fall, but it seemed mostly intact. He grabbed the plastic bag of tubes and wires as well. He couldn't take it back to Ayan's room. Hayes would just confiscate it again, or worse, kick the old man out. Turner needed a secure location. He looked toward the concrete ramp leading down to the facility's boiler room. He had the only master key. Making a split-second decision that could cost him his job, Turner lugged the heavy equipment down into the subterranean warmth of the basement. The following morning, Ayan received a folded, grease-stained note slid quietly under his door. The handwriting was messy and rushed boiler room. 2 p.m. Don't let Hayes see you. At precisely 2 o'clock, Ayan faked a stomachache to skip the mandatory recreational bingo session and slipped down the back stairwell. His heart hammered a frail rhythm against his ribs as he navigated the dim, concrete corridors of the basement. When he reached the heavy steel door of the boiler room, it clicked open before he could even knock. Turner pulled him inside, shutting the door quickly and locking the deadbolt. The room was sweltering, dominated by the rhythmic, deafening thrum of the facility's massive water heaters. "Over here, Mr. Harrison," Turner said, leading the bewildered veteran behind a tangle of insulated pipes to a small, forgotten utility alcove. There, resting on a sturdy wooden workbench, illuminated by a single harsh work lamp, was the Collins R390A. It was battered wet and stripped of its dignity, but it was there. Ayan felt a sudden fierce prickle of tears behind his eyes. He reached out his trembling fingers, tracing the scratched metal faceplate. You saved it." "Why?" Turner shrugged, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek. Hayes is a jerk, and my grandpa was in the Navy. He used to fix things too. Couldn't stand seeing this in the trash. You can use this space. I'm the only one who comes down here, and Hayes is terrified of the basement because of the asbestos warning on the door. It's safe. A fire reignited in Ayan's chest. The tremor in his hands vanished instantly as he assessed the damage. The chassis is cracked, and the primary oscillator tube is shattered, Ayan muttered, already lost in the technical puzzle. But the core wiring is intact. I need a power source and a ground. An earth ground. I can tap into the 220-volt line from the old backup generator. Turner offered, catching the old man's infectious energy. And there's a copper water main right behind you for the ground. For the next 3 weeks, the boiler room became a clandestine laboratory. Ayan worked with a manic-focused intensity he hadn't felt in decades. Since Hayes had confiscated his primary antenna, Ayan had to improvise. With Turner's help, they ran 50 feet of raw, unshielded copper wire up through the ventilation shafts, winding it discreetly around the iron grating on the facility's roof. But Ayan wasn't just repairing the radio. He was completely re-engineering it. The fall into the dumpster had destroyed the standard VHF and UHF commercial receivers. The only way to make the machine functional again was to hardwire it to pick up extreme, ultra-low frequency ULF analog signals and highly compressed sidebands, the kind of frequencies once used by military black ops during the Cold War, because they bounced off the ionosphere and were nearly impossible to trace. What exactly are we trying to listen to? Turner asked one late evening watching as Ayan carefully seated a glowing vacuum-sealed pentode tube into the makeshift breadboard. I don't know yet, Ayan admitted, his eyes reflecting the warm orange glow of the filaments. But in the signal core, we learned that the air is always full of secrets. You just have to know which shadows to look in. Modern digital encryption is tough, but a lot of people make the mistake of using raw analog burst transmissions for local off-the-grid communications because they think nobody monitors these dead bands anymore. Ayan flipped the heavy steel toggle switch. The radio hummed to life. The speaker crackled, emitting a wash of thick, hissing white noise. Ayan's fingers danced across the tuning dials, making micromillimeter adjustments. Nothing but static. Days turned into a week. They picked up fragments of maritime weather reports, the occasional ghost echo of a ham radio operator in Russia, but nothing substantial. Then on a Tuesday night at 1:14 a.m., the white noise abruptly dropped dead. Ayan immediately held up a hand, silencing Turner. The speaker emitted a sharp, repeating electronic chime. Ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. What is that? Turner whispered, the hairs on his arms standing up. A preamble. Ayan breathed, his eyes widening. It's an attention signal. Someone is opening a secure channel. The chime stopped. A voice broke through the static. It wasn't human. It was a synthesized mechanical voice, female, speaking with a bizarrely flat, rhythmic cadence. It was a numbers station format, a method of broadcasting encrypted espionage codes, but the signal strength was incredibly strong. It wasn't bouncing off the atmosphere from overseas. It was local. It was originating from somewhere within a 5-mile radius of Boulder. 7-2-9. Break. Cargo is secure. Break. Route confirmed. Ayan frantically grabbed a pencil and a grease-stained notepad, scribbling down the phonetic cadence. Delivery window, 0400. Acknowledge. There was a burst of compressed digital screeching, a response from another local transmitter. Ayan's radio couldn't decode the digital burst, but the analog voice returned moments later. Confirmed. Disbursement to offshore account verified. Tell Hayes the ledger is balanced. The pines are clear. End transmission. The frequency instantly collapsed back into a wash of white noise. In the sweltering heat of the boiler room, the silence between the two men was deafening. Turner stared at the radio, his face pale. Did that robot voice just say, Hayes? Ian stared at the notepad, the pencil nearly snapping in his grip. Not just Hayes. The pines are clear. He looked up at Turner, his military instincts dormant for 50 years, suddenly roaring back to life with terrifying clarity. Whispering pines. They're using this facility, this retirement home. It's a front. Ian had spent his life dealing with codes, logistics, and supply chains. The terminology cargo offshore accounts ledgers, combined with a highly illegal localized analog burst transmission, painted a very clear, very dangerous picture. Gregory Hayes wasn't just an arrogant corporate administrator trimming budgets. He was running a sophisticated smuggling or money laundering syndicate right out of the retirement home, using the constant stream of medical delivery trucks, pharmaceutical shipments, and high mortality rates as the perfect untouchable cover. And Ian Harrison, the old man they had thrown away like trash, was the only person in the world who had just tapped their secret wire. Mr. Harrison, Turner stammered, stepping back toward the door. We need to go to the police, right now. No, Ian said, his voice surprisingly steady, hardened by an authority that made Turner freeze. If we go to the local police with a story about a ghost voice on a junk radio, Hayes will know. He likely has them on his payroll anyway, or at least has enough influence to bury us. He'll destroy the evidence, fire you, and lock me in a psychiatric ward. Ion turned back to the glowing dials of the Collins R390A. The tremor was gone. He wasn't a frail old man anymore. He was a soldier behind enemy lines, and he had just intercepted the enemy's battle plans. We don't call the police, Turner, Ion said, a dangerous razor-thin smile touching his lips. We listen. We record. We map their network. And then we burn his empire to the ground. Weeks bled into a tense nocturnal routine, while the rest of Whispering Pines slept under the influence of heavy sedatives and late-night television. Ian and Turner waged a quiet war from the subterranean heat of the boiler room. Ian had successfully spliced a vintage belt-driven Nakamichi cassette recorder into the Collins receiver's audio output. Every night between midnight and 4 in the morning, the heavy spools of magnetic tape spun silently, capturing every synthetic syllable, every compressed digital squeal, and every logistical coordinate broadcasted by the invisible syndicate. They quickly deciphered the basic operational language. The pines are clear meant the facility's night staff was either bribed or asleep. Disbursement referred to the money laundering pipeline, which Ian tracked to a series of offshore accounts mentioned in alphanumeric codes. But the most chilling discovery was the cargo. By cross-referencing the broadcasted delivery times with the facility's official logs, Ian found the discrepancy. Every Thursday at 3:30 a.m., a nondescript medical supply truck arrived at the rear loading dock. Officially, it was dropping off surplus saline and adult incontinence supplies. Unofficially, according to the phantom radio broadcasts, it was moving high-grade stolen narcotics, oxycodone fentanyl, and raw precursors, using the nursing home's legitimate medical licensing as an impenetrable shield against random inspections. Audio recordings, however, were not enough. A defense attorney could claim the tapes were fabricated or lacked context. They needed physical proof. They needed the ledger. He keeps it in his office, Turner whispered one Tuesday night, leaning over the workbench. The yellow light cast long dramatic shadows across his exhausted face. I had to fix the HVAC vent in Hayes's suite yesterday. When he stepped out to take a call, I saw a heavy steel wall, safe hidden behind that awful abstract painting he bought last month. That's got to be where the physical records are. Ian rubbed his temples, his mind calculating variables. A safe means a combination, or a biometric lock. We can't crack that without explosives, or a specialized drill, neither of which we have. But the cargo. If we can get photographic evidence of the narcotics being unloaded and moved into his private storage, the FBI will have probable cause for a raid. Turner swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I can get the photos. My phone has a decent night mode. But I have to get dangerously close to the loading dock during the Thursday drop. Thursday arrived with a biting, bitter frost that coated the facility's windows in a layer of opaque ice. At 3:15 a.m., Turner slipped out of the boiler room, dressed in his dark Navy maintenance coveralls. He navigated the labyrinthine service corridors with practiced silence, avoiding the security cameras he knew were operational. He positioned himself behind a stack of broken wheelchairs in an alcove directly adjacent to the loading dock. The freezing air stung his lungs, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline coursed through his veins. At exactly 3:30 a.m., the heavy metal roll-up door rattled open. The idling growl of a diesel engine filled the concrete bay. A white box truck devoid of any company logos backed into the dock. Gregory Hayes was there. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. Instead, he wore a dark overcoat and leather gloves, looking nervous and sharply alert. Two men jumped out of the truck, thick-necked, quiet men, who moved with dangerous military precision. They didn't unload boxes of adult diapers. They unloaded heavy reinforced Pelican cases, locked with heavy-duty padlocks. Turner raised his smartphone. His hands were shaking, threatening to blur the image. He steadied his elbows on the armrest of a broken wheelchair, held his breath, and snapped a series of photos. Click, click. The digital shutter was completely silent, but to Turner it felt as loud as a gunshot. He captured clear images of Hayes, handing over thick manila envelopes, undoubtedly cash payoffs in exchange for the cases. He caught the license plate of the truck. He had them. He was just lowering his phone when a rogue empty oxygen canister, disturbed by his shifting weight, rolled off a nearby shelf. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp metallic clang that echoed violently through the loading bay. Hayes froze. The two men from the truck instantly dropped their hands toward the heavy bulges under their jackets. "Who's there?" Hayes barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "Check the alcoves." Panic seized Turner. He couldn't run. The hallway was a straight shot with no cover. He had seconds before they found him. Thinking faster than he ever had in his life, Turner grabbed a nearby mop and bucket, pushed them out into the open, and stepped out behind them, feigning a deep, groggy yawn. "Just me, Mr. Hayes," Turner muttered, rubbing his eyes and looking appropriately terrified of the dark men with the guns. "Sorry. Boss told me the floor buffer leaked oil back here yesterday. I was just coming to mop it up before the morning shift slipped on it." Hayes's eyes narrowed into terrifying, predatory slits. He stepped forward, invading Turner's personal space. The smell of expensive cologne and stale coffee washed over the young maintenance worker. Hayes looked at the mop, then at the scattered wheelchairs, and finally at Turner's pockets. At 3:30 in the morning, "Patterson," Hayes asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "I work the night shift, sir," Turner replied, keeping his heart rate completely out of his voice. "Maintenance doesn't sleep." Hayes stared at him for 5 agonizing seconds. He clearly didn't buy the excuse completely, but he also couldn't risk a messy altercation with a staff member, while $1 million in stolen narcotics sat on the loading dock. "Clean it up and get out," Hayes hissed. "And Patterson, If I ever see you near this dock during a scheduled delivery again, you'll be looking for a new career. Understand? Yes, sir. Absolutely. Turner mopped a dry floor for exactly 2 minutes, then retreated. He didn't stop shaking until he was securely locked inside the boiler room. He showed Ian the photos. "It's enough," Ian said, his voice grim. "But Hayes isn't stupid. He's spooked. He's going to accelerate his timeline. He'll move the stash, scrub the ledger, and likely terminate your employment or worse. We are out of time." Desperation forces innovation. Ian knew they couldn't just walk into a local police precinct with a smartphone and a cassette tape. Hayes's localized network was too entrenched, and a corrupt deputy could tip him off before the ink on a warrant was even dry. They needed federal intervention, and they needed it immediately. "The Collins R390A is a receiver, Mr. Harrison," Turner said, watching in bewilderment, as the old veteran began violently ripping wires out of an old microwave they had scavenged. "It can't broadcast." "It couldn't broadcast," Ian corrected, a fierce, almost terrifying spark of genius in his eyes. "But radio waves are just energy, Turner. If you can catch them, you can throw them. I'm stripping the magnetron from this microwave to build a crude, high-voltage oscillator. I'm going to rig it directly to the receiver's antenna array." To do what? To hijack his frequency and boost it. We aren't going to call the FBI on a phone. We are going to blast his exact coordinates, the safe combination methodology I deduced from the ULF tones, and the audio recordings of his deals directly onto the Regional Federal Emergency Management Agency monitoring band. It's a restricted channel. The moment we transmit every alphabet agency within 3 states, we'll triangulate this building in seconds. It was a suicide mission for the equipment. Pushing that much unregulated voltage through the jury-rigged system would melt the circuits within minutes, but they only needed 90 seconds. By 11 p.m. on Friday, the trap was set. But upstairs, paranoia had finally consumed Gregory Hayes. He had spent the day reviewing security footage. He noticed Turner's absence from his regular rounds. He noticed the slight fluctuations in the building's power grid during the exact times the phantom radio transmissions were occurring, and most importantly, he remembered the old veteran in room 214 and the highly sophisticated piece of junk he had ordered thrown away. Hayes didn't bother with corporate protocol. He bypassed the local police entirely. He gathered the 2 armed men from the supply truck who had remained on site in a vacant guest suite. "The basement," Hayes ordered, pulling a master key ring from his pocket. "Check the boiler room." Down in the sweltering heat, Ian connected the final copper grounding wire. "Power it up, Turner. Full voltage." Turner threw the heavy breaker switch they had wired to the 220-volt generator line. The lights in the boiler room dimmed violently. The Collins receiver didn't just hum, it screamed. The makeshift oscillator glowed a terrifying, blinding cherry red. Ozone and melting plastic filled the air. "Transmitting," Ian yelled over the deafening whine of the overloaded capacitors. He hit the play button on the Nakamichi tape deck. The recorded synthesized voice, detailing the syndicate's crimes, surged through the wires, amplified 10,000 times, hurtling out into the night sky on a highly classified federal wavelength. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the boiler room shuddered violently. A massive impact dented the metal inward. "Patterson, open this door." Hayes's voice roared from the corridor, muffled but furious. Another heavy crash shook the frame. The deadbolt began to bend. "They're breaking in," Turner shouted, backing away from the door, grabbing a heavy pipe wrench. "Hold the line, son," Ian commanded, his eyes glued to the smoking dials. He grabbed a microphone he had wired into the circuit. "This is a priority flash transmission to all federal monitoring stations. Contraband ledger located in administrator's office wall. safe Whispering Pines facility boulder. Immediate tactical response required. Acknowledge. Crash. The deadbolt sheared off. The heavy steel door flew open, slamming against the concrete wall. Hayes stood in the doorway, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage, a heavy maglite flashlight in his hand. Behind him, the two armed men raised their weapons, their eyes locking onto the sparking, smoking monstrosity on the workbench. "Shut that off!" Hayes screamed, stepping into the room. "Destroy it!" One of the men stepped forward, leveling his pistol at the radio. Before he could pull the trigger, the thick, hissing static on the radio's speaker cut out. A booming, crystal-clear voice echoed through the sweltering boiler room, freezing everyone in their tracks. "Station unknown. This is Denver Field Office, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Transmission received and verified. Signal triangulated. Remain on the line. HRT units are 3 minutes out." The color drained from Hayes's face. The maglite slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. The two armed men exchanged a panicked look, instantly lowering their weapons and bolting for the hallway, abandoning their boss. Hayes stared at Ion. The arrogant corporate tyrant was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man. You're just an old man. You belong in a home." Ion Harrison stepped away from the smoking, melted remains of his beloved radio. He stood tall, the tremor in his hands, completely absent, his posture reflecting the proud Signal Corps veteran he had never stopped being. "I am an old man, Mr. Hayes," Ion said softly, his voice cutting through the ringing silence of the room. "And you made a fatal tactical error. You underestimated the junk." 3 minutes later, the wail of sirens shattered the quiet Colorado night. A dozen black armored vehicles tore into the facility's parking lot, deploying heavily armed federal agents who secured the building in a matter of seconds. They found the ledger exactly where Ion said it would be. They found the narcotics in the storage wing. Gregory Hayes was escorted out of Whispering Pines in handcuffs. His expensive charcoal suit rumpled his empire, completely dismantled by copper wire vacuum tubes and a 78-year-old man who refused to be discarded. A month later, Whispering Pines was under new state-appointed management. Turner Patterson was promoted to head of facilities, complete with a salary that wiped out his medical debt. And in room 214, sitting proudly on a brand-new reinforced oak desk, was a freshly polished, federally sanctioned piece of hardware. It wasn't the Collins R390A that had melted into a heroic puddle of slag. It was a state-of-the-art Yaesu FT DX101 MP transceiver, a gift from a very grateful regional director of the FBI. Ion Harrison adjusted the heavy dial, listening to the comforting crackle of the global airwaves. He was no longer just listening to the shadows. He was a guardian of the frequencies, proving to the world that true heroes never truly retire. They just change their wavelength. The truth is out there, hidden in the frequencies we ignore, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Ion's fight against a corrupt system proves that you are never too old to stand up for what's right and rewrite the ending of your own story. If this veteran's incredible resilience inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a great underdog story, and subscribe to our channel for the thrilling conclusion.